Started. Okay, so we're actually on to chapter 3. The video lectures for chapter 1 and 2 are posted on Canvas in multiple places. So we're gonna move over to chapter 3, which is called Clash. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to type something in the chat, and then we can go from there. So clash means that, you know, I say potato, you say potato, and there's clash, right? Because sometimes people have an argument and they'll just say, well, you're dumb, you're ugly, right? When you see that we're arguing about whether someone's dumb and then whether someone's ugly, there's no clash. It's just different points going, like two ships passing the night. And a good argument has clash, right? That people actually respond to each other's arguments. They don't just say what they want to say, right? Which is when you look at your outline format for student congress, number 1 and number 2 in your persuasive speech, you know, there's a lot about clash. You need to confront the opposite side's arguments. You don't just say like why I should get the job in job interview, but you should talk about why all the other candidates shouldn't get the job, right? So you need to like go attack the opposition's arguments and then also present your own. So responding to an argument, that's really what it's all about. And so a lot of times in life, we say that silence means consent. So, you know, in court, that's true, by the way. Is it true in life or at work? So if I ask you a question like, are you cheating on me? And your boyfriend or girlfriend answers that with silence. A lot of people say that means yes, right? So it's just kind of, if you don't respond to an argument, you're silent about it. A lot of people in arguments will say that means you're conceding it to be true and you're losing that argument, right? Which is why it's important to respond to an argument and have clash, right? So directly confront and disagree with what they're saying, as well as presenting your own arguments. Clash occurs when there's actually disagreement over a particular issue, right? Not like you're ugly, well, you're dumb. Those are two different arguments, right? We can argue about whether someone's ugly or not, or whether they're dumb or not, but they're totally different arguments, right? So you're gonna have clash. You're ugly. No, I'm not. Yes, you are. You're dumb. No, I'm smart, right? See, that's how it's supposed to work. So skepticism. Don't believe everything you see, you hear, you read, and be a skeptic. That's actually a mark of intelligence, people who are skeptical. Like if you were a little kid and they told you about Santa Claus and you were like, what? That makes no sense. That's skepticism, right? You tell a lot of other kids about Santa Claus, they bring you presents, they're like, awesome, right? They don't question the story they're being told. They're like eating it up, right? So skeptics question things that they see, they're told, what they read, what, you know, like there's so much deep fake videos now that you can basically make everything look like something's happening that isn't, right? That's actually done by artificial intelligence, AI. So understanding a new idea requires 2 steps. So number 1, let's accept that the new information is accurate to understand the new ideas, right? So we make an assumption that this information we're getting is accurate, right? Because in today's world, there's a lot of misinformation out there. And number 2, once the ideas are understood, we test them to see if they are accurate, right? So if somebody tells me, hey, gravity on Earth generally makes everything fall down, right? I can test that out. I don't just assume you tell me gravity exists that I'm like, okay, I believe it, right? I'm going to test it out because I'm a skeptic. So I'm just going to drop things like my ruler. And yeah, well, guess what? Gravity is true because I can actually see it with my own eyes and test all the information I'm being told. Okay. It's a skill to develop, being skeptical, right? A lot of people call it street smarts. I think you have common sense or street smarts. By the way, when I was in college, I remember a lot of told me, oh, you have book smarts, but you don't have street smarts. And I always think about that and say, okay, and you go and get on the street and negotiate with people, right? And have interactions with them, and you start to learn some street smarts. And you do realize that you should never believe everything people tells you on the street, or everything people told you on the street, right? Be curious but cautious, right? Curious but cautious, right? So remember, and another good example is if a deal is too good to be true, it's not true, right? That's like a general rule that you should always skeptically keep in mind. Anytime someone tells you something, this deal is too good to be true, it's probably not true. It's something you're being manipulated or misperceived, right? And then skeptics are not dogmatic. So dogmatic means that they're incredibly stubborn. These are people who will will go to the death believing something rather than, even if confronted with evidence to the contrary, they're like, no, right? So understand that, because you can be persuaded even though you're skeptical, because you test the information, and then if you see it's true, you're like, I agree with it. Dogmatic people would be actually like, no, right? So the dogmatic people believe in something so much that they will go to the death believing that rather than change their mind, right? Like religions have a lot of dogmatism built into it, right? So fight or flight. So human brain process and response to stress and we're talking about page 55 of your textbook here, talks about, if you didn't know, and this is a really good principle to understand yourself and understand other people and their choices. When humans are stressed, we have an instinct in our brain that's called fight or flight. So you have a test coming up, right? That causes stress. What's people's reaction to the stress of the final exam or the test? It's fight or flight. What's fight? Study, prepare, read, get everything done. Flight is delay, procrastinate, ignore, right? And so you can kind of see how everybody in life, when you make choices, when there's stress involved, you see that there are choices, a manifestation of fight, commitment, resolution, like resilience and getting it done. And then there's flight, delay, ignore, procrastinate, just give up and surrender, or don't even try, right? Because you miss every shot you never take. So a lot of people don't even take the shots because they're buying into the flight instinct manifesting in their brain from stress, right? So, okay. A very useful formula to remember is E plus R equals O when it comes to fight or flight. And so E stands for event, R stands for reaction or response, right? So an event, response, or reaction leads to O, outcome. That's life. Okay, so all the different E's out there, events, are just actions that have happened to you. It could be someone, bumped into your car, give you a slight dent and fender bender. That causes stress. The reaction is you got angry, you just got their information, their driver's license, and you were calm about it because you realized, like, for example, my kid's been in the car when we got in a crash, and I was very calm because I realized they're watching you, and you don't want to be getting angry and upset with the other driver. That doesn't help the situation at all, in my opinion, right? So you want to make sure everyone's safe, and then everything, you get all the information you need for an insurance and driver's license, and you get the police report done if you can, and then you're good to go. All right, so reaction is our quick, unthinking answer to an action, while a response is more of a thought or answer where we look at alternatives to select the best one for us in that situation. So again, either reaction or response. A lot of people react to an event. They don't think, they just kind of do something. Response is you think about what you should do and then choose the best situation, right? So, and then O is the actual outcome. So be a responder, not a reactionary type person. How many of us know somebody who always reacts to something, right? They don't think, they just kind of do, right? And then responders are people who really, something happens and you can see them contemplating making smart choices, even given tough circumstances, right? So E plus R equals O. So ways to disagrees. Name calling. This is totally ignoring an argument, instead just calling the person issuing an argument an unwelcome name, like you're dumb or you're ugly, this example I used earlier. You probably did this as a small child to your siblings or playmates. Example, you're just crazy, right? You're weird. I actually hear my children say that all the time, right? It's just name calling. That's actually not arguing, right? It's just basically what we call the Latin phrase ad hominem, which is an attack on the person, and that just causes people to get mad, and then that leads to fights. Right, not arguments. Arguments escalate into fights, right? We don't want that. Arguments should stay arguments. Ad hominems. Oh, I just talked about this. So this is attacking specific aspects of the source, the person of the argument, without referencing any aspect of the actual argument, right? Example, you don't have a college degree. What do you know, right? So think of how, like, that's attacking the person. That has nothing, they're giving their opinion on In-N-Out hamburger. Like, is it relevant that you have a college degree to have an opinion on In-N-Out hamburgers? Now, maybe you have a more sophisticated question. A college degree might be relevant, but you see that that's just an attack on a person, right? So do not do that one either. So name calling, bad. Ad hominems, bad. These cause escalation, and these cause, again, arguments to become fights, right? Now, responding to tone. This is attacking the tone of the argument, because people put a lot of nonverbal impressions into an argument, like right? The tone of way you say that noise even has an effect. So instead of actually looking at the actual content of the argument, so example is, wow, your tone is way over the top, don't you think? Right? So you're not discussing what they actually said, the substance of it. You're again going over their tone. And you might say that to your children sometimes. I don't appreciate that tone of voice. Okay. And so, but if my daughter or my child, they'd be like, Father, that's actually not really a good argument. You're just responding to tone, not the actual what I asked or said in my argument. So like, okay, fair enough, right? But then respect the parent there, right? And then contradiction. This is what you want to do to disagree, not name call, not use ad hominems or respond to tone, but disagreeing by stating an opposite side. Potato, no, potato. Tomato, no, tomato. With virtually no actual evidence to support this presented argument. No, I didn't, or you're wrong. Basketball is a better sport than football is a good example of that, right? Contra means against. So just you're contradicting what they said, right? I like blue. I like red, right? You're not explaining why blue is bad and red is better. You're just saying, you're just contradicting, right? Now, so again, this is not a great way to disagree, but it's way better than the first three. But counter arguments, now you're getting into the ways to actually clash and be an intellectual arguer. So this is where you contradict the initial argument, but also back it up with reasoning and evidence. So this is an actual argument. And what the author Graham considers the first form of a convincing disagreement. No, the death penalty does not deter crime. Evidence. In Ohio, when they initiated the death penalty, crime actually increased, right? So if the death penalty is supposed to reduce and deter crime, Ohio should have seen crime decrease when the death penalty occurred, but actually the opposite happened, it increased, right? So you have a counter argument. You contradict, but then back it up with reasoning and evidence, right? Now, refutation, another good strategy. Here, instead of making a unique counter argument, a mistake in the initial argument is found, and an explanation of that mistake along with evidence and reasoning is presented. So here, no new argument is made. We were just finding the weakness in the initial argument. So refutation is the skill to say, okay, I'm going to actually just go after your argument in support of your position and show that it is completely wrong. Therefore, there's no reason to do what you were saying we should do, right? So that's a great strategy if you can find evidence that refutes the situation, right? I'll give you a good example. Somebody accuses me of murder, and I refute that by coming up with an alibi. An alibi is proof that I'm not where the murder happened, so I couldn't have done it, right? For example, nowadays, everyone has a phone, and I could just most people, their phone is a snitch, 100%, by the way. It'll rat out your location pretty much all the time. And we can just say, hey, the murder happened in this neighborhood and his phone, and there's some, other, like credit card bills that night from 30 miles away. So there's in no way it could have been him, right? That refutes the argument that I was the killer, because it's just going after their accusation that I'm the killer. Right? I'm not proving my innocence. I'm actually just proving that their argument pointing the finger at me is completely wrong. Therefore, I'm innocent. By the way, that's called geofencing. When you use people's location data on their phone to figure out if they were somewhere or not somewhere. And that's a new cutting edge field of legal and criminal prosecution. So if you're a criminal, I would never have a smartphone with me. I wouldn't even bring it. I would leave it at home. So it can't even be in any way, shape, or form used against me if you're doing criminal acts. Refuting the central point. Another great strategy in clash and a way to do disagree. And this is explicitly refuting the main point of the initial argument instead of refuting some of the supporting parts of an argument. Here we focus on the key central point of the initial argument. Is abortion murder, right? Because they say it's a choice. Well, you're definitely killing something. Right. And so it's interesting about, can we go over to what's the central point of abortion? Right. Well, maybe it's not life. It's about choice. That's an interesting question, right? So you kind of see that it's a life, it's a choice, kind of do this thing where they don't actually clash too much, right? We're going to say is it a life? Do you know one, I think, interesting way that we determine death is when your brain activity starts. It's not like when your heart stops or you stop breathing. You're dead if your brain is dead for a certain amount of time, right? There's no activity. And if I say, well, we know when you're dead by brain activity, how do we know? Let's look and see what happens. Are you alive by brain activity? So I'm just going to say fetus and brain activity. When, or search, you have week 8 electrical brain activity. So my argument would be an abortion in the first 7 weeks is not an abortion, because it's not a murder, because the thing is not even alive. Because the definition of death, which makes sense to say that that's also the definition you're alive, is fetuses get electrical activity in the brain at week 8. Pretty good argument for why we should limit abortions to just the first 7 weeks. I didn't expect that, by the way. But anyhow, interesting. So, okay. You can see that's my example of central refutation, right? It's going to the point where, like, if you say it's murder, well, first of all, we have to determine that's it alive. So you kill it, then it's actually a murder, right? But if it's not alive, that's not a murder, right? I'm just saying, no brain activity using the standard of death, applying the standard of life in the first 7 weeks. The fetus at week 8, though, remember, Roe versus Wade was the first 2 trimesters. So that was, if pregnancy is 40 weeks, it's like 26 weeks you could do an abortion legally. Right now that's gone, and states are choosing yes, 5 weeks, 8 weeks. Roe in California, I think we're doing the first 2 trimesters too, right? So you get 6 months. Okay. Understand there's always 2 sides of an argument. We need to, a good arguer, good debater always knows both sides of the argument, right? I go to a cop, he says, you were speeding. I know what all the arguments he's going to make or she's going to make that I was speeding and I should get a ticket. And then I've gone all over the arguments that I'm going to make, and I'm going to refute some of the arguments that the police officer is going to make, right? And if that's true, I should get out of the ticket. So, and remember, when you're talking to a police officer, you don't ever want to insult them and get them mad, because then they're just going to give you the ticket, right? So that's why you keep calm, you keep polite, and you don't do the ad hominems or the name calling. Don't be like Mr. Pig, right? That's not a good way to start off a discussion with the cops. So remember, there's always, in the 2 sides of an argument, it's always pro versus con. We can generally say, as a binary sort of way to analyze the world, that there's a bunch of reasons an argument has, on the pro side, and the con means which against is for or against. So in a way to understand that. So discussions can have many sides, but a debater argument is always basically about pro-con. Procon.org is a terrific resource. If you've never checked it out, it's right here. You should check it out. It has every topic you would want to discuss, including your student Congress bills. It covers universal health care and nuclear power. And you have all these different topics for your persuasive speeches. And if you go to something like, should we have the penny? You'll find that there's evidence in a pro-con format that pro-con has organized for you, right? 7 sources talking about the pros and cons of having a penny in circulation. Apparently, it costs more money to have a penny out there than not to have a penny. So we could just round up to use the nickels. And most people don't give a crap about pennies. They throw them away, right? And so it's just interesting about how maybe we should just get rid of them. And if we go digital, it won't matter at all too, by the way, right? So it's a great resource. Check out procon.org. And remember, when you cite the sources, you want to cite the footnotes, the real research. Procon just gathered the research on their website. They didn't actually do the research. So when you cite them, you actually want to find what they call the primary source. We'll cover this in the textbook a little bit later, and not the actual secondary source. Sorry, I need to go back to full screen. Hold on a second. Oh, there we go. Share. Okay. If you're not using Procon, especially you can even look at some stuff about the death penalty on procon.org as well, right? Although it's not going to have too much on particular specific death row inmates. And remember, your death row inmate can be someone not in America, by the way. Right? You can talk about the example that I put up. Lindsay Sandiford was a British grandmother arrested in Indonesia, right? So. All right, enthymemes. That's actually a Greek word, and there are 2 parts to this type of argument. An enthymeme, an observation that leads to a conclusion, right? So you see something kind of with your eyes, and then you conclude this, right? I'll give you an example. I go to a homeless camp. I see lots of drug use. So I observed lots of drug use at the homeless camp. I might conclude homeless people use a lot of drugs, or even worse, drugs lead to homelessness. Right? So that's an enthymeme. Examples of an enthymeme could include Ernie's going to be a violent person because he plays violent video games, right? I've observed that violent video games apparently cause kids to be more violent. And if you play them, I can assume that you're more violent, right? If Terry exercises often, she will be healthy. Okay? So I've observed that people who exercise seem to be healthy. And I can test that and find out that's true, by the way. Vote for John Doe, he won't raise taxes. And then Bill Gates is brilliant because he started Microsoft, right? So that's an enthymeme, where you basically make an observation that leads to some kind of conclusion. It's actually not a strong argument. Again, a skeptic, don't believe everything you see, right? So the syllogism, this is the second type of argument besides the enthymeme. This is a format. This format is a form of deductive reasoning that starts with two initial propositions that lead to a conclusion. The initial proposition and assumption is implied in the enthymeme. So here are my propositions. All professors are brilliant. Jim Marteney, the author of the textbook, is a professor. Therefore, I can conclude all professors are brilliant. Jim's a professor. Jim is also brilliant, right? Okay. Syllogisms are really strong arguments. Deductive reasoning is really strong form of reasoning. It's just that you have to make sure it's accurate, right? Because I can question this syllogism is wrong because why? You want to type the answer in the chat, right? What's wrong with this syllogism? And the first premise here that all professors are brilliant, right? It's not true, right? Some professors are not brilliant. So this deduction is false because this proposition is false, therefore the conclusion is false. But if the propositions are true, then the conclusion is also going to be true. And that's the strength of deductive reasoning and the syllogism. Inductive reasoning. This is kind of the default form of reasoning for all human beings. We tend to think inductively. We don't really do syllogisms and think deductively. Inductive reasoning, is when you take an example and you generalize to the whole. So I might say, Juan loves tacos. Juan is Mexican. Therefore, I can conclude if Juan loves tacos and he's Mexican, all Mexicans love tacos, right? So inductive reasoning, you take like one example, one experience, one instance, and then you generalize to the whole, right? You say, oh, Professor Lee is good at math. Professor Lee is Asian. Therefore, all Asians are good at math, right? And that's another good example of inductive reasoning. So you can see that it's full of errors because the example that you're using to reason from could be a poor choice, right? And therefore, extrapolating to all Mexicans or all Asians becomes super stereotyping and not true in most situations at all. The Toulmin approach to argument. So this is where we're going to focus on in this class. He was a communication professor who came up with a model that pretty much everybody uses nowadays. And so it's on page 59 and 60. It's called the Toulmin model. That's his last name, Joseph Toulmin. And in his work on logic and argument, the uses of argument from Professor Toulmin, 2008, Toulmin defined 6 parts that make up an argument. So first you make a claim. Then you have grounds for the claim, a warrant, backing, any reservations or rebuttals, and then a qualifier. And these are the 6 kind of parts of an argument, right? So I might say, I am Jesus Christ. Okay. I have a beard, because you've seen most of the pictures or not pictures, but actually drawings and paintings of Jesus Christ. He has a beard. So there you go, right? Okay. He was probably not white man either, by the way. But in most of the depictions, he's like a European Caucasian. But anyhow, so the grounds, what are those? Well, I'm going to say I have some standing and some points, like I have the beard, and I can preach, and my dad is God and the Holy Spirit, and I can turn water into wine. I can walk on water, feed many people with 2 loaves and a couple fish, and warrant. That is, what are the assumptions and justifications for my claim? This is where it gets weak, and backing is the evidence. You should test me. Can I give me some water? Can I turn it into wine, or can I walk on it? Right. The other tests of whether I am Jesus Christ as my claim. And then, did I make any reservations and rebuttals? For example, a reservation might be like, well, I'm Jesus Christ only when it's Easter Sunday, once a year, right? And then a qualifier would be, probably I'm Jesus Christ, or maybe I'm Jesus Christ. The words probably, maybe qualify the claim and make it smaller and more limited, right? So that's the Toulmin model. So, and we'll really deep dive into claims, warrants, and grounds and backing as we move through the death row case presentation, because you'll make a claim that this death row inmate is guilty or they are innocent, right? And we'll go through what are the grounds for making that claim. You have a warrant for this claim. What's the backing for this claim? DNA evidence, or like you have a smoking gun, so he's guilty, or she. It's, by the way, he is fair. Almost virtually everybody on death row is a man, and people who kill other people are all males. Women are very, very, very rare. In fact, you want to choose a death row case inmate that's going to be interesting, choose a woman, because there's so few of them compared to how many dudes there are. Any reservations or qualifiers about my argument? And then you take a look at that. So arguing from the con side, this is page 64. So you're opposing an argument because you're on the con side, right? Should we raise the minimum wage? No. There are a bunch of reasons, there are a bunch of cons to that. And so therefore I'm going to oppose raising the minimum wage, federal minimum wage across the whole country, right? So the con side rejects the pro side and stays with the status quo. The status quo means what exists today, right? So I'll type in XQ as the status quo and like, what is today's status in California? What is the status quo for marijuana? So y'all can type that answer in the chat if you know. That means you understand what the status quo is. If you don't, you need to answer this question, figure out how to answer this question. All right. Okay. And the general rule is if it ain't broke, why fix it? Right. So the con side kind of just says, hey, the status quo is good. It's not broken. So why change it? Why fix it? Right. It's a lot of time and energy, a lot of money, a lot of time to change things. Right. So, and most human beings, we kind of like, generally, if you're happy, you like the status quo. People don't like having their life disrupted, right? And having the status quo change. Well, yeah, but legally, just legally, remember, as a law, laws in California related to marijuana, what is the status quo? Yeah, it's recreationally not accepted. It's recreationally and medically legal. Right? We have laws that say generally for recreational medical purposes, you can have marijuana, which was totally, I think, what is that, 2016, 2017, 2018 that happened. So things have really changed from when I was a kid or in college and as a young adult. So I went to Bill Maher last Saturday night. He played up in Lake Tahoe, and he was joking about how before they legalized marijuana in California, he would always, he's a lifetime user. And he was like saying, I was always worried I would get arrested at the airport or, traveling around. And now I don't ever worry about that. Although if you're Brittany Griner, holy schmoly, right? Don't bring marijuana to Russia. You'll end up in a freaking penal colony. So, okay. So understand the argument from the con side is I'm rejecting the pro side. I'm saying stay with the status quo, which is what is currently in place, right? So if I want to now on a federal level, what's going on with marijuana? It is illegal, 100%. And if you didn't know, federal law always beats state law. So if I go to Yosemite and smoke marijuana, I can get arrested, even though I'm California, but Yosemite is a national park and it's actually federal jurisdiction. So you could get arrested for smoking marijuana in Yosemite, right? Even though you bought the marijuana in California outside the national park legally, but once you bring it in and use it on federal land, it is technically illegal. I've heard rangers, those are the enforcement officers at the national park and the federal level, will warn you or will sometimes ticket you, because a lot of people have tried to do that. They just assume that it's cool because I'm in California and it's legally recreational. But the status quo means whatever is in place now, because we call it the status quo. And a lot of people are trying to change the status quo by raising the minimum wage, right? By banning the death penalty. You're changing the status quo. So right now, status quo is the death penalty is legal, state by state by state. Right. Okay. Now let's use the Tolman model, claim, grounds, warrant, backing, reservations, qualifiers, to develop a con strategy. So we want to reduce the significance of the problem or the potential advantage of their solution. So I'm looking at their pro argument. They're saying we should raise the federal minimum wage to $15. I'm going to say, well, the problem they're trying to fix that people get paid right now, some places $7.25, is, well, the places they get paid $7.25, the cost of living there is super low, right? So they don't need as much money in those places In California, the cost of living is maximum, right? So in California, it makes sense to have a minimum wage that's much higher here. But a federal minimum wage will make it everywhere in the country. So it would. So I'm just saying that the problem that they're suggesting, the pro side, is actually much less significant than we think, because the cost of living in California is totally different from like West Virginia or Mississippi or South Dakota, right? And I can also say the advantages of raising the minimum wage that they're pointing out on the pro side aren't actually as big as they say. And I'll give you a great example of that. When we legalized California marijuana, they said we are going to collect lots of taxes for the schools, for all this other stuff, and that's great. And that's why a lot of people voted for it. They found, since we've legalized marijuana, the tax collection revenue has been minuscule because there's a huge black market. Because there's a tax on legal marijuana, a lot of people in California buy illegal marijuana where it has no tax and it's dirt cheap compared to buying at the dispensary. So hence the taxes actually created a black market, which hurts the tax collection, because people go to the black market and avoid the taxes rather than going to legal marijuana and paying the taxes. And so you're saying that, hey, the pro side said legalizing marijuana will result in a lot of tax revenue, a big advantage potentially. And I'll just say, no, that's not true at all, right? It's a con strategy. So I'm not even saying marijuana is good. I'm just saying their advantage is not even true, right? And if you look that up, so sorry, share screen. We can see if this is true. Has California collected lots of tax from marijuana? So in 5 years or 4.5 years, we've actually collected $4 billion, right? 2 billion in excise tax, 494 million in cultivation taxes, and 1.5 billion in sales tax, right? So they've actually, since 2018, collected $4 billion. Now, let's find out. Oops, this link, just find out that it's dipping, right? And the first year they legalized in 2018, the tax revenue was high, and every year after that, it's actually gone smaller and smaller, right? And you can just see that in this article, since 2018, taxing cannabis is when they started, right? The state started, it's brought in 3.76 billion, right? The other article said 4 billion, so a little more updated. And they're just saying that there's a bunch of obstacles to collecting these taxes. There you go. So they haven't, what they said was going to happen isn't true on the pro side, right? And that's a good con strategy. Don't assume what people argue and say is true. A lot of times they're making stuff up, or what they're claiming isn't actually going to happen. There are a lot of assumptions, right? Like when people, oh, you should buy cryptocurrency, you'll be rich. There's a lot of assumptions that goes into that. It's like when, which one, you have to sell it at the right time. So if you look at how much money has been lost in the cryptocurrency market in the last year and a half, it's staggering, right? And you see the what is the exchange that Sam Friedman Bank is in jail now in Palo Alto. His parents are Stanford professors. He's in prison for the exchange that collapsed overnight. So anyhow, all right. And then the pro side solution will not solve the problem they intend to solve, right? So a con strategy is also to just say, hey, the solution that they're saying, right? Homelessness is definitely a problem, no doubt. I think the big debate over homelessness is, what are the solutions, right? It's not that there isn't a problem, right? It's more about what are the solutions. So, attacking their solution for homelessness is probably the best con strategy, because you can't really prove that homelessness isn't happening and isn't a bad thing, right? So it's all about that solution won't work, and in fact it'll make it worse, or it's just waste a lot of money. They found that throwing money at homelessness doesn't work. Like just putting the California put a couple $1 billion towards it, renting motels, trying to build tiny homes, and they just found that, for example, every time you do that, you spend the money, all the people in the neighborhood got mad and complained about it, right? NIMBY. So you can kind of, not my backyard people come up. So you see that just the money to make all these things happen doesn't actually happen because people don't want homeless people in their neighborhoods. It's pretty much a fundamental issue that we have, right? Con-side alternatives. So you've thought about, okay, here's some different ways that I can just go on the defense of the status quo, basically, right? That's the con sides. We have straight refutation. In straight refutation, the con side directly refutes point by point the arguments brought up by the pro side. This is what attorneys do, because remember, silence is consent. If you don't attack their argument or disagree with it, it's considered to be true, which then can be used and really hurtful to you in a court of law later on. And I actually found that in court, that's number one reason people lose, is they just don't disprove what the other side is saying, right? They're just trying to prove what they're saying, right? So, and using this approach, the con side argues for keeping the status quo in place. The status quo is the current fact, value, or policy that is being challenged by the pro side. The con side argues that any of the pro side approaches by refuting the problem and the solution, right? Remember, so attack the problem or attack the solution or attack both. Denying all advantages from a change in the status quo. So prove that the status quo, if changed, won't lead to these things that are like the marijuana tax collection they thought they were going to get. Totally has been way under. And every year it's going down. It's shrinking since 2018. And then also argue against the alternatives being presented. So if the pro side stated there were 2 reasons why we need to test welfare recipients for drugs, by the way, I think that's a good topic for your persuasive speech. Florida does it because they found that a lot of welfare recipients just buy drugs when they get their welfare money, or people get welfare money and gamble it at the casinos, like the Indian casinos. They knew that because all the ATM withdrawals from the debit cards from welfare were being taken out at ATMs at the Indian casino. That's how they know that, by the way. So yeah, let's look at the 2 reasons why we should test welfare recipients for drugs. So many recipients of welfare are using drugs, and testing will find out who the drug test users are, right? And that seems like a terrible waste of welfare money to give to somebody who just uses it to feed their addiction. Now, the con side using straight refutation would say, well, the people promoting the claim state that many recipients of welfare are using drugs, but argue that there are not that many recipients of welfare that are using drugs, and you get some data that says most welfare recipients are not drug addicts. Drug addicts are they're like so in the street, they don't even collect welfare, right? They're more like street people. And then they also say that their tests will find out who the drug users are, right? But I will argue that testing as proposed will not actually give us accurate information, leads to false positives. A hair test is super accurate up to like 5 years, but costs like $10,000. So most people just use urinalysis, which costs like a couple $100. But P-tests can go wrong on a lot of different levels. If you take NyQuil, you could fail a drug test, right? NyQuil is a cough medicine with some alcohol, some other interesting chemicals in it. And there's actually examples of that people who took NyQuil, went to work, got drug tested, and then they tested positive and got fired, and they were like, WTF, I didn't do anything. I didn't take this drug, right? You see a lot of athletes make this claim. It's a lie, but they're like, oh, I didn't use the steroid. I was taking this, right? Now, the con side will still need to use evidence to prove their contentions, or else they are just assertions, not real arguments. You need evidence that says, look, most welfare users don't use drugs, and I need evidence that says drug tests aren't accurate. They are wrong a lot of the time, right? Now, we can also do this strategy, which we won't cover in the exam or really in real life. It's a very, very, very technical thing, but it's called defense of the status quo with just minor repairs. And this approach is that the status quo is generally doing an effective job. If there is a problem that the pro side is bringing up, it can be dealt with by making a minor change or repair in the status quo. There is no need to make a major change or an overhaul of the system like the claim of the pro side suggests. An example of minor repairs occurs when a couple needs a larger house to accommodate their growing family. Instead of buying a new home, selling their old house, they can adopt the minor repair approach and do some add-ons to the existing home, right? So I need more space for my family, my house. You don't need to buy a new house and sell this one and move. You could just see if we can remodel your current home and add more space, right? So that'd be an example. Let's keep the status quo, stay in this house, but we're going to make some minor repairs and improve and build on this house and add some space. or build an ADU, like a granny unit in the back. Another example is when people avoid the cost of buying a new car by getting their old one repaired, right? You're like, oh, my old car is pretty beat up. It's not super reliable, but the status quo was old car. New car would be, let's change the status quo to a new car, right? But I might say, hey, from money perspective, I'm just going to keep on repairing the old car and go with that status quo because I'm not ready to buy a new car. I can't afford it right now. Like right now, car loans are super expensive, and car prices are generally still pretty high. There aren't that many factory incentives, and you saw during the pandemic, used car prices hit a record. Now, the counter proposal, also very technical. We won't go into this in the class when we actually do our assignments, but the counter proposal is, in this approach, the con side admits that the overall goals of the pro side's case are actually good, but the way the pro side is offered to reach them is not a good approach. So in this alternative, the con side presents what they feel is a better alternative. So the other team, the pro side says, hey, we need to raise the minimum wage. And your counter proposal is like, yeah, you're right. But not $15. It should be $17, but adopted incrementally $1 per hour increase over the next 10 years, right? So we give every year the federal minimum wage goes up by $1 until it hits $17, right? And as opposed to they're going to make it $15 tomorrow, right? From $7.25, more than doubling. Right? Does everybody see that? So I'm going to say, you're right. We need to increase the minimum wage, but not the way you're going to do it. We're going to do it this way, 10-year, 1-year incremental change for $1. And then the maximum is actually going to be $17 instead of just 15. Right? So we're not doing 15 overnight. We're doing 17 over the next 10 years. So we're adding $1, right? So it'll go to 8.25, 9.25, and then over 10 years, it'll be 17.25. Because the minimum wage right now is 7.25, right? So that's an example of a counter proposal. The con side admits that the pro side has shown a weakness in the status quo, and we should change it, but just not the way they say it, right? We should do it this way, right? So that's called a counter proposal. All right. Now, the importance of clashing as silence means consent, or at least suggest consent, right? So it's important to clash. Let's make sure we respond to our opponent's arguments, not just say our arguments, which is why I don't like it, because people will write an argument and they'll just stick to what they wrote. So it doesn't matter what the other side says at all. They're just saying whatever they wrote, right? So make sure you, in your bill then, you go and rebut the opposing side's views, right? Okay, build that into your brief, right? Don't just prove your argument, go after your opponent's arguments as well. And that's what a really good arguer or debater does. We talked about that earlier, right? So emphasizing that a lot. Okay. So we have different levels of clash, calling from name calling to straight up refutation. The first step in effective refutation is examine the argument being presented, right? Let's really examine the pro side's argument in this case, because I'm on the con, and not just assume it's true. And I'm going to question the hell out of it. I'm going to be super skeptical, right? Now, by using the Tolman model, claims, backing, grounds, reservations, we can find weaknesses in arguments that occur in the argument, including the backing and or the inclusion of reservations. So if you look at a lot of evidence, right? I was just reading the story about MH370, the Malaysian jetliner that disappeared in 2014. We still haven't found it, right? Super just disturbing, weird case. A lot of cover-ups for sure going on. But if you look at some of the evidence presented, like about the airplane, you'll find that there was actually a lot of qualifiers and reservations in it, right? Like they were like, we think this is part of the airplane. They found a part of the wing of Boeing 777 in Reunion Islands near Madagascar, right? Which kind of thinks that the plane crashed in the Indian Ocean somewhere. But if you examine the evidence, they found the wing and they said, yeah, it's from a 777, but the part model is missing. And that thing, the little part number shouldn't be missing. It's basically, if the wing is still there, the part number should be on it, it's missing. And so somebody thinks that the people were like, I would question that and say, that evidence is fake. It's been planted. They found a Boeing wing, threw it in the ocean. And then when someone found it, they said, hey, this must be part of MH370, right? But there's no part number. So you found a wing of an airplane in the ocean. This plane disappeared, but the evidence doesn't link the two because there should be a part number that we know is on that particular flight, that Boeing that crashed or disappeared, right? Which is Malaysia flight 370. By the way, there's a show on Netflix right now. That's one of their top 10 that covers this. And you can kind of look at you'll see all the evidence that are out there. There's a lot of reservations and qualifiers with all the evidence. You kind of go like, this evidence is not nearly as compelling as it sounds like it should be at all, right? Because you find out there's reservations and qualifiers in their arguments. And then all these things, again, lower the validity of the argument on what we call the continuum of certainty. This can reduce the validity level to below your threshold of acceptance. So we're going to later on learn a lot about what we call the continuum of certainty. It's basically like 100% from 0%. How much do I believe in this argument? 0, 50%, 100%, right? And that's called the continuum of certainty. I'm certain that it's true. That's 100%. I'm not sure at all, 1%. It may be true, 50%, right? And that's what we call the continuum of certainty. So arguments every argument you go to and you're presented with evidence, you'll kind of be on your continuum of certainty, you'll be like, I'm pretty much sure this is 100% true. I don't know, 0 to like, I think it's true, like, but I'm super skeptical. I'm very doubtful of my opinion, but if you made me guess, I'd say it's this one. That'd be 50%. You can kind of see, right? How much do you trust your friends? 0, 30, 60, 75, 87, 100 being the max, right? You kind of just have this continuum of what we call certainty. In the threshold is the line at which you believe or don't believe, right? So like some people might say my threshold of acceptance is 2/3. If I think something is 66% probably true, I accept it as true. If something is 90% true, I accept it as true. If something is only 10% true, then I don't accept it as true at all, right? And you kind of see that the threshold is whatever percentage on the continuum where you kind of like is the dividing line of true, false, or believe or don't believe, right? So there you go. All of us, and our threshold changes depending on what we're looking at, right? Your threshold of acceptance about your parents is probably really, really low, like, right? Because you love your parents and you're going to support them no matter what. But think about your threshold of acceptance to a stranger that says, hey, the earth is flat, right? You know, how certain do you need to be before you reject that claim? And that threshold on that issue, that line, 66%, 80%, 90%, 50%, right, is your threshold. Now, there are 3 traditional approaches used to refute an argument. Again, there was straight refutation, defense of the status quo with minor repairs, and a counter proposal. The last 2, which are very technical, we are not going to cover on the final exam or use in the class. Chapter 4. So we got 20 minutes left. So here we go. Let's talk about chapter 4. Okay, so let's make sure we define a claim. We'll go back to the Toolman model. Claims are the first thing we want to look at, right? So the foundation for all argument is the claim. If you were a gold rush person, a 49er, and you came to California looking for gold, you were trying to find a claim where you would say, I own or control this part of the earth. So any gold that comes out of that part is mine, right? So people are always, and then bad guys were always doing what they called claim jumping, right? Oh, your claim has gold on it. I'm going to jump it and try and steal that gold from you in some way, right? And that person was called a claim jumper. So a claim is any single statement of controversy advanced for the purpose of argument. So both sides of an argument, the pro side and the con side in a debate, should argue the same claim, right? We should raise the minimum wage. No, we shouldn't. Yes, we should, right? The claim is a statement much like the topic of an argument, but it does much more. Claims represent both the starting point and the ending point of an argument. That is, remember, my claim was, I am Jesus Christ, as an example of that. That claim is false, by the way, but just because a claim is false doesn't mean that's not a claim, right? So that is a claim is advanced by an advocate to provoke an argument. It is that claim that will end up being accepted or rejected at the end, depending on how much we prove and on the continuum of certainty. The claim is the main point, the thesis, and the controlling idea. You can find the claim by asking the question, what is the advocate trying to prove? That we should raise the minimum wage, right? That we should ban the death penalty, that we should give lots of military aid to Ukraine to win so they can win the war against Russia, the Russian invaders. Right now, the pro side will argue for the claim and thus a change in what is currently happening. Right, they oppose the status quo. They want to change the status quo. The status quo is on the con side. It's whatever exists today. Right. So the con side will speak against the claim that the pro side's making and support the current existing situation referred to as the status quo. And then my example of a claim is God is real. Pro tries to prove the claim. con tries to disprove the claim, right? So pro is trying to say God is real. Let's prove that God is real. Interesting definition of God, by the way. And like, does it count, like, if we're talking about like in Islam, because there are a lot of many gods, but anyhow, right? And then con tries to disprove the claim. There is no God. That's what Stephen Hawking wrote on his deathbed. He was the black hole physicist British guy who had the broken body and talked with a robot voice. A lot of people thought he was the smartest human on the planet at the time. So a lot of people agree with that, by the way. That's a claim. All right, Stephen Hawking was the smartest human on the planet until he died. Interesting claim, right? Pro would try to prove God or Stephen Hawking is brilliant, and con would try to disprove it. Now, there's other people, right, that are more brilliant, or he wasn't that brilliant at all. So characteristics of a claim. Claims are phrased as statements, not questions, right? A claim is not, so you should not be making questions in your arguments, in your debate. Everything should be a statement, right? Period. The goal of a claim is to promote a pro versus con debate style environment. Claims often emerge as a result of a discussion where many points of view are presented, but in the debate, the claim is a statement. Claims are phrased against the status quo in order to create the potential for controversy. So remember, claims are against the status quo because we want to change the status quo. The status quo is broken or it's got problems. The status quo, again, refers to current beliefs, policies, rules, behaviors, or institutions. So if I tell you you should become a vegetarian, the status quo, unless you're already a vegetarian, is that we are omnivores or maybe carnivores even, right? That's really bad for you, by the way, to eat meat all the time. So you would change the status quo from omnivore or carnivore to herbivore, right? So status quo can be three things: an individual stasis, that's their balance level, where they are most comfortable, some institutions' current beliefs, values, or policies, or the starting point for an argument. So a properly phrased claim is one which challenges the status quo, right? We should raise the federal minimum wage. Because the status quo was $7.25, and I want to raise it to, I don't know, $12, $13, $14, $15, $16, $17. There's usually very little controversy in advocating a claim that promotes or reinforces that which already exists, right? If people say we should continue doing what we're already doing, people are like, okay, so there's no argument. That's why we don't really have to worry about that, right? Now, if a child wants her curfew changed, it would make much more controversy if she went to her parent and said, my curfew should be left at midnight. The parent would nod in approval and there would be no debate. Now, if she went to her parent and said, my curfew should be 3 a.m. instead of midnight, her parent most likely would take exception and respond to that with an argument against what currently exists. If the current status quo cannot be clearly defined, but in this case, we know it's midnight, the advocate is free to phrase the claim as he or she would like, with the claim becoming the starting point for the argument. All right, so claims should be phrased in an unbiased manner so that both sides have an equal opportunity to advocate, support, and defend their positions, right? So you'll see the student Congress bills. Should we have universal health care? Should we have nuclear power in the United States? Right? They're unbiased the way their phrasing is. So each side, pro and con, universal health care, pro and con, nuclear power, pro and con, they have plenty of stuff to say and equal opportunity to say it. Properly phrased claims should be as specific as possible. Broad is bad, narrow is good, right? Properly phrased claims should be as specific as possible, which is why a lot of arguments have, or claims have, qualifiers and reservations built into them, right? I like this one. IIRC. It means if I recall correctly. So I will make an answer, I will guess an answer and say IIRC. And then my answer is wrong. And people will say, hey, you were wrong. And I say, no, I wasn't. They're like, what? I'm like, I said, if I recall correctly, this is the answer, right? Does everybody see that? My qualifier is if, right? If this happens, then it's true. If it didn't happen, then it's not going to be true. So I always, whenever I make any kind of guess where I'm going off my memory and where I'm not sure, I always say, if I recall correctly, or IR. And that tells the person, you know, I'm going off of memory that might be old. We can always just check on, you know, Google it today to be accurate, right? But if I recall correctly, we've collected since January 2018, California's collected $4 billion in cannabis tax revenue, right? And if you look it up and you're like, it's 4.1 billion, I'll say, yeah, well, let's Again, if I recall correctly, right? Great qualifier. So I just want to be as specific as possible whenever possible. Now, effective claims promote a pro-con argumentative environment, and the claim should be phrased so that the burdens, we'll learn more about these later, of obligations responsible of each arguer, you have a burden of rejoinder, burden of proof, for example, are clear to both sides involved in the debate, and then both sides debate the same claim, because that way we have clash. Because if you don't debate the same claim, there's no clash, and we have no argument, essentially. The types of claims. You need to know these. I'm flagging these. Make sure you are aware of these three. So we have claims of fact, claims of value, claims of policy. You need to recognize, like on the final exam or a quiz, I might give you some claims. You'll have to identify, is this claim a claim of fact, a claim of value, or a claim of policy? When I said, I am Jesus Christ, do you know what kind of claim that was? Is it a claim of fact, a claim of value, or a claim of policy? Well, a claim of fact asserts that something quantifiable has existed, does this exist, or will exist. Claims of value assert some qualitative judgment along a good to bad continuum relating to persons, events, and things in one's environment, right? Give me liberty or give me death, Patrick Henry. Yeah, he was saying liberty and freedom is more important than life. Right, and that's a claim of value. And then claims of policy are, we should do this by agent of action. So the federal government should raise the minimum wage. California should illegalize recreational marijuana. Arizona should lower the drinking age to 18. Right, we should lower the drinking age to 18. You see that you see the agent of action, the federal government, the state government, the municipal government. Local county sheriff, right? You have to explain who's supposed to actually implement and enforce the policy. And then the policy is what we should do. And it could be changing laws, regulation, or domestic or foreign policy. Like we should give military aid to Ukraine, right? Give them jet planes and tanks, which by the way, right now we're not doing, but we're preparing for it. I've been reading that we're training Ukrainian pilots and tank commanders on some basics of American jet planes and American tanks so that we can see if it's even doable. But that sounds to me like, well, if you're training them, you're like making it ready. But and if you saw, the Germans and Polish are sending tanks and airplanes to the Ukrainians, but the Americans have not. We don't want to piss off Russia. They have nuclear weapons and Putin. So like how much we help Ukraine, we have to do it in a way that doesn't antagonize Russia. Right, too much. So it's like poke the bear, but don't poke him too hard that the bear unleashes the nukes and then the whole world goes to hell. So that's kind of the fine line that we have to negotiate and navigate right now. Now, the argument into burden. So let's learn about this. Oh, and by the way, it's a claim of fact when I say I am Jesus Christ. I said that something has existed, does exist, or will exist. So that's a claim of fact. All right. So the argument into burdens. One of the functions of a claim is to establish the argument and the burdens of the participants. As has been described, there are two sides of an argument, the pro side and the con side. Now we are going to look at the responsibilities and the burdens of each side. What does the pro side need to do? What does the con side need to do? If you don't do these burdens, a lot of times judge will say you lose the argument or the debate or the trial because you never fulfilled your burden. Right, so burdens are things that are imposed on the con side and the pro side, and if each side doesn't fulfill them, it could lead to your losing the argument. So the argumentative burden describes the responsibilities of each participant of the argument, pro or con. The person speaking in favor of the claim or promoting the claim has different responsibilities than the people defending the status quo or speaking against the claim, which is the con side. So the burden of proof comes first. So we often, in legal terms, we call this the BOP, the burden of proof. So if you charge someone with murder, the prosecution has the burden of proof, right? To prove that this is the murderer, right? If they don't meet the burden of proof, that person is considered innocent. They should be let go by the authorities. All right. So this means that the side or person promoting the claim, the pro side, must present compelling reasons why the status quo is inadequate and should be replaced by the claim being advocated. When this is done, the status quo is presumed to be inadequate and in need of change. So the burden of proof on the pro side is, let's prove that the status quo is broken and has problems. And once we've done that, we've met our burden of proof, right? So burden of proof in a lawsuit would often be that there's something damages happened, that I called the plumber, we signed a contract, I paid him, and then the plumber never showed up, and then my house got destroyed when the plumbing went wrong. Right. So if I proved that we had a deal with the plumber, that I paid him, but they never got the services in return, I've met my burden of proof. And that's on to the con side. and their burdens. No, so the burden of presumption is the defense of the status quo and belongs to the side opposing the claim, the con side. So this burden is based on the presumption that the status quo is desirable and should remain in force. So there's a burden of presumption on the con side that says, let's just presume that the status quo is good until the pro side proves it isn't, right? So burden of presumption just says we presume the status quo is good unless pro side proves it isn't, right? So if they meet the burden of proof on the pro side, they're going to overcome the burden of presumption, which is the status quo is okay. No, it isn't, because the pro side proved it isn't. So they've met their burden of proof, so the burden of presumption goes away. Now, if they don't meet their burden of proof on the pro side, the con side will win on the burden of presumption. Hey, the pro side didn't prove there's anything wrong with the current system, the status quo. The status quo, by burden of presumption, is presumed to be okay, and so we win. So a lot of people say if it's a tie, the burden of presumption lets the con side or the defense win, right? Because you presume that the status quo is okay. And if it's a tie, that's when you make that presumption, right? Because the pro side didn't prove their burden of proof to overcome the burden of presumption. Now, the burden to make a prima facie case. This is actually a Latin phrase meaning at first sight, and it's used in common law to describe a case that is strong enough to justify further debate. So the pro side has a burden called, you have to make a prima facie case, right? So when I say I am Jesus Christ, I have a burden to make a prima facie case, which is that at first sight, my claim seems reasonable. I have a beard, like I talk to God every day, my Father, pray. I'm trying to think of like what would you need to say, like that seems like reasonable, just first sight looking at their argument and that person, whether what they're saying is true or not, right? And if they haven't met the prima facie burden, then pro side loses. Right. So and pro side has a burden of proof. They also have the burden to make a prima facie case that just says we have this case should continue through the court system because I've made a prima facie case. So all cases that are fake and don't even have enough initial proof to prove at first sight that their argument is legitimate get thrown out of court for lacking prima faciality. Does that make sense? Right. So that's why you keep all the trivial BS stuff out, because if you come to court, you have a prima facie burden. And if you don't meet that, the other side will win and they will sue you and say, you should pay for all my legal expenses and court costs because you brought all this to court, made me spend all this money, and your shit was fake and not even prima facie, right? And so the judge might say, yeah, I'm going to give legal fees and court costs to the winning side because the other person just brought this lawsuit to harass and I think that's true because they did not meet their prima facie burden, which is at first sight, they seem to have a reasonable argument. Now, the burden is the need to respond to the arguments of the other side. This is called your burden of rebuttal. So both sides have to do this one. If during the argument you do not respond, remember silence means consent, you fail to meet this burden, right? So the burden of rebuttal is pro and con have a burden to respond to the arguments of the other side. So don't just make your arguments, but you need to go and counter whatever the opposing side argues. Now, how do you know what the opposing side says? You need to listen to them. I'll give you a good example. I know a lot of people, when they argue, they're just thinking about what they want to argue, and they're not even listening to the opponents. If you don't listen to your opponent, there's no way you can enjoy your burden of rebuttal, because you need to listen to what they're saying in order to rebut what they're saying, right? So I take a lot of notes when the other side speaks, so I can prepare my rebuttals to everything that he just said. Now, remember, there are no ties. Pro or con must win the debate. Remember, if it's a tie, usually the burden of presumption wins for the con side. Fake news, page 80. There's a lot of it out there. There's just a lot of it, right? There's a lot of it for a lot of different reasons. Some of it's on purpose. Some of it's just, in a rush to get a story out there, bait, what they call clickbait to make money. Other times it's intent, just disinformation about the war, about what's happening. And so what happens with fake news? It often ignores their burden of proof. So National Public Radio summed up the problem very clearly when they stated, as with many other conspiracy theories, like the assertion that a Washington pizza restaurant was at the center of a child sex ring tied to top Democrats. That's what they know as Pizzagate. Turned out to be super false. And it goes all the QAnon, by the way. This kind of assertion in part functions by trying to shift the burden of proof rather than proving with hard evidence that there was a conspiracy surrounding Rich's murder. He was a Democratic senator's aide. He was found murdered, still unsolved. So a lot of people say that this guy Rich was murdered because he knew that the Democrats were running their sex trafficking ring, and they killed him to silence it, right? And that the owners of Comic Ping Pong, the pizza restaurant, were harming the children. The people making the unproven claims end up pushing the other side to try to disprove it. So what happened is they made the QAnon people said, hey, this pizza restaurant, Comet Ping Pong, is where they're holding the children, and we got to rescue them. So this guy actually showed up at the pizza restaurant with his AR-15 looking for children to free. And then everybody was like, what the fuck? And that's what Pizzagate was, right? So he was in the QAnon conspiracy theory. They believe that top Democrats run a child sex trafficking ring, and that our job is to save the children and rescue them. So this guy, said Rich's murder is all proof of this child sex ring, and we know this pizza restaurant's where they're doing it, and he showed up there and actually trying to rescue the children with his machine gun. And all this was false, right? Now, so this example shows that fake news or these conspiracy theory people, what they do is instead of proving that this thing is true, they kind of say, we don't need that. We don't need to prove it. It's just true, right? And that's why they ignore their burden of proof. That's why you can't bring this stuff to court, right? Because in court, you have a burden of proof, and you don't meet it, gets thrown out, and then they'll throw the legal expenses at you. So more and more people get their news from the internet and social media today. Netflix's The Social Dilemma examines this issue. It's a great documentary you've never watched. It just shows you how powerful social media is and what it does to make us addicted and look at it all the time, and how it spreads fake news really fast. Because there's no fact checking, and a lot of other people there's no burden of proof, right? You can just say anything on social media. I am Jesus Christ, right? I could go to my Facebook or Instagram and type that right now. So then there's lots of misinformation occurring. People have not yet sorted out in their minds how they're going to incorporate social media into their news streams. They may be inclined to believe a false report originating on social media, like the Pizzagate thing, QAnon theory, because it feels more magical, more interesting, and even more authoritative because it seems more unmediated. This is from Andy Tucker from Columbia University. So you can kind of see that there's an allure to these like false reports on social media, right? Everybody just wants to chime in. It's a way to participate. So the focus of the chapter, wrapping up chapter 4. Good critical thinkers, those who desire constructive conflict resolution, need to focus their argument on a clear, correctly worded claim. In this chapter, we focused on a claim is an unbiased statement worded against the status quo, presented by the pro side. There are only two sides to an argument. You're either for the claim or against the claim, right? So student Congress bill, you're either for nuclear power or for universal health care, or you're against them both. There is no any other position, right? There are only two sides to each argument. And you'll notice that the bill is unbiased and correctly and specifically worded. The side of the claim you support directs the burdens or obligations you have in the argument. So if you're the pro side, you have the burden of proof or the burden of rejoinder for both sides. The con side, you also have the burden of presumption on your side. Pro side has the burden to make a prima facie case, and you both have the burden of rebuttal. The side of the claim you support directs the burdens or obligations you have in the argument. And then finally, if you allow the burdens to be switched, you can be easily manipulated. Don't let that happen. Don't let people who are changing the status quo shift the burden of proof onto you, right? They have a prima facie burden, and the burden of proof always goes on the pro side. We'll talk about next week, chapter 5 and 6. I'll see you then.